it's a bit of a rare opportunity, and you have had a very rare pair of life experiences. You must feel pretty lucky, huh, man?
I don't know if luck's the word, but I do feel responsible for telling the public about these experiences since I did have them. So I'm happy to share any part of it with you. And of course, I've been investigating for about 20 years now.
Man, that is such a long time.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It is.
Well, I'm a little jealous, I have to say, but let's get into this experience that you had in the Air Force. I think a lot of the audience is aware of these types of things. We hear about them a lot in ufology, but I don't know how often we hear one detailed by someone who was actually really there. So I guess walk us through what happened.
Okay, in 1967, I was a missile launch officer in Montana, stationed at Great Falls, Montana. I was part of a two-man crew, and our job was basically to monitor and launch missiles if ordered, and these were intercontinental ballistic missiles. So on this one particular evening, we went out to a place called Oscar Flight, which is located about 100 miles east of Great Falls, Montana. It was one of 15 what we call launch control centers or launch control facilities where we had a capsule underground, concrete and steel, hardened capsule. And we went on duty about every 3 days or so. We had about 6 guards upstairs. On this particular night, this was March 24th, 1967. My commander was Fred Mywald. We went, we relieved the crew on duty, and then after dinner, he took a rest break. One of us had to be awake at all times. Sometime in the evening hours, I get a call from the topside guard who says there's lights flying above the facility, making strange maneuvers, flying very fast, turning on a dime, making 90-degree turns. They wanted to report it. They said they weren't airplanes. I didn't quite know what to think of all that. I kind of discounted it at the time. And then he called back about 5 minutes later. This time he's screaming into the phone, saying that there is a glowing red object hovering above the front gate. Scared to death, had the guards out with all their weapons, and he simply wanted me to tell him what to do next. I was kind of shocked. Of course, I didn't know exactly what was going on, but he was serious and he was frightened. I could tell by his voice. So I think all I said was make sure nothing comes inside the gated area,
Right.
and then he had to hang up, and so I went to tell my commander about the phone calls, and as I was starting to tell him about the phone calls, we got a lot of bells and whistles going off inside the capsule. We have klaxons and warning lights and sounds that go off. So we look over at the board, and all 10 of our missiles were going no-go, are disabled while this object was still up there. And we had a way of querying the system to find out what was wrong, and they were all reading guidance and control system failure.
Huh.
So we had a inertial guidance system on the missiles. They're very sensitive, of course, to being a locked-on target or locked on their location. So there's a very particular piece of equipment called the logic coupler, which was upset. So this object, whatever it was overhead, would have had to send a signal to each one of our missiles separately and interfere with the logic coupler of each missile. It would have had to have penetrated, the signal would have had to penetrate 10 separate cables, which are triply shielded against electromagnetic interference. So
Wow.
that was it in a nutshell. We later were notified that the same thing had happened in another flight. I thought it was that night, but as it turns out, it was a week earlier. Same situation where UFOs came over and shut down 10 of their missiles. So within the span of 8 days, we lost 20 missiles,
Wow.
UFOs.
20 missiles over 8 days. I mean, did you guys feel like you were under attack?
It felt like it. I felt there was some kind of maybe a terrorist attack going on topside. But the thing is, Those missiles were not damaged at all. The guidance system was simply upset. There was no damage to the missiles. We got them back up on alert within 24 hours. We had to send crews out there. But basically, my take was that this was simply a message. The message being, get rid of your nuclear weapons.
And that's a very common thing we hear in ufology, that's what abductees have said that they were told.
Mm-hmm.
These facilities keep getting screwed with a little bit. But it's interesting to me because I had typically thought that when this happened that the systems just lost power. But this seems like a way more calculated kind of thing, targeting this logic coupler. They must be familiar with the systems in some way, it almost seems.
Absolutely. They're very well familiar with our systems. And there was another incident when the Echo flight, which was the one I mentioned a week earlier, they had a crew go out of one of the sites there. And I got this information from the man that was actually there. He was working to restart the missile system, retarget it. And while he was working, one of the guards upstairs again, because he had to go down into the tube where the missile was actually located. But one of the guards upstairs said that there was, pointed to an object in the sky. There was this orange ball again above the facility. He noted it and told him to report it to the command post. He went back downstairs and started going through his checklist to restart the missile. And every time he'd get to a particular point, the missile would shut down again. And he'd go through his checklist again. He did this many times, he said. He tried it over and over, and each time he got to a specific point in his checklist, the missile would shut down.
Huh.
That indicated to him that this object was intelligently controlled, and they knew exactly how our systems worked.
Man,
yeah.
For these beings to be able to manipulate some of the most complex weapon systems on the planet, like puppets on strings, I mean, it leads me to think that either our technology is pretty typical for a civilization at our level, and maybe they do this across a whole host of evolving planets, or they're somehow human, maybe surviving Nazis who had advanced on their technology. I mean, a lot of researchers talk about that being the source of some UFOs. Is that something you consider a possibility?
No, I don't consider that at all.
No, you don't. This is clearly non-human in your eyes.
These are non-humans. If this were human intelligence in 1967, we certainly would have heard more about it by now. No, again, what this object was able to do was penetrate 60 feet of earth and concrete with a specific signal, very specific, penetrate the triply shielded cabling system we had and send a signal to this particular piece of equipment. And they did it to each of the 10 missiles separately. These missiles were not interconnected in that way.
Man, that is just so... I don't want to say scary, because I'm actually more scared of the puppet masters in the power pyramid that want these missiles to go off or built them for mutually assured destruction in the first place. But it's definitely a security risk for sure.
It did certainly cause a big stir within the Air Force. Some of the top commanders came down to Malmstrom Air Force Base and interviewed the previous crew, the Echo flight crew. By the time our incident happened, I was at Oscar Flight. This was, there was a full-blown investigation going on, and we were simply told not to talk to anybody. And primarily because the Condon investigation was ongoing, where Edward Condon of the University of Colorado was given a contract to study the UFO question for the Air Force. But it was basically a whitewash. The Air Force did not want us to talking to them or anyone else. So we were ordered never to talk about this.
Of course. I did want to ask you, did you get the vibe that these people who were telling you to be quiet, did you get any impression that they were less surprised about the story?
Yes. As a matter of fact, I did. When the next day we were told to report to the squadron commander's office, I walked in the office with my commander, and the first thing I asked him, the squadron commander, was whether this was an Air Force exercise. He said, absolutely not. He said he has no idea what happened or why. I thought they would want us to give them a full briefing of what happened, and And no, that was not the case. With my squadron commander was a member of AFOSI, Air Force Office of Special Investigation. And again, I thought they would, ask us a lot of questions, but it seemed like they already knew what. Again, because of echo flight happening eight days earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Now, all he wanted to do was have me sign these papers saying I'd never talk about it again.
Right. And I mean, obviously you waited a huge number of years, but and you are talking about it now. Have there been any repercussions, or what got you to start talking about it?
Okay, well, and of course, this order was in writing, and it specified that even after I was out of the Air Force, I was not to talk about this under penalty of prison, and etc. So I resigned from the Air Force in 1971, and then I went to work for aerospace industries and then Federal Aviation Administration. In 1994, I was getting ready to change careers and become a teacher, and I was in a bookstore at the University of Washington and picked up a book called Above Top Secret by Timothy Good.
Mm.
And in there on page 301, there's a short paragraph stating that missiles went down at Malmstrom Air Force Base during a UFO event. I got kind of excited because I thought the Air Force had declassified, because here it was in print, and nobody was supposed to know about this.
Mm-hmm.
So I took a chance and went to the local MUFON, Mutual UFO Network, and talked to an investigator there named James Klotz, and asked Klotz to send a FOIA request to the Air Force, not mention anything about UFOs, and see if he could get more information about this. No, he did. And we got a return mail stating that this incident was still classified. However, since it had been so long, they were going to declassify it. So they declassified what I refer to as the Echo Flight incident. That was the one that happened previous to ours.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought at the time, because it described it so that matched what I recall, I thought it was my incident. So I started speaking openly about it, because that incident had been declassified. But it wasn't until later, maybe a year or so later, that I found out, no, I was at Oscar flight and my incident happened 8 days later. So here I am. I'm public about it, so I decided to keep going. Up to this point, I have not been contacted by the Air Force or any government agent telling me not to speak about this.
Wow, man. I mean, I appreciate it. I know so many people out there do appreciate your willingness to talk about this, because it's something that's super important to me. It's one of the most interesting things on the planet, the situation with UFOs, and to not hear about these things, it's sinful. It's so wrong. I really think that we deserve to know, and we should be more interested as a culture. It seems like the mainstream could care less about getting to the bottom of this issue, which is a little bit sad, but
I agree.
there must be so many other stories out there, who knows how weird, of people who've just never ended up talking because they signed one of those similar documents to yours.
Oh, not only that, but it's the ridicule factor is still out there. People don't want to be laughed at, and they don't want to lose their reputation or their jobs. That is a serious deterrent to people coming forward. But yes, there are a lot of people out there that have a lot of information, but have, for whatever reason, have not come forward yet.
And how commonplace now are these missile shutdowns? I mean, this also just isn't an American problem. This has happened in other countries too, right?
Absolutely. In my book, I list about 14 other incidents. This has happened at other bases within the United States: Ellsworth Air Force Base, South Dakota; Francis E. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming; Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota. It's happened at base in Italy, NATO base in the Netherlands, Soesterberg, where nuclear weapons were being stored. It happened at Bentwaters Base, which is in the UK. Again, nuclear weapons storage facility. UFO comes over, shines a beam of light over the facility. Aviano Air Base was the one I was thinking of in Italy. A NATO base, again, nuclear weapons. UFO flies over, shines a beam of light on the weapons storage area. So I'm convinced that really what they're up to with regard to nuclear weapons is to literally shine a light on them and state a message, send a message that these things can do us no good at all and could possibly obliterate all living things on planet Earth, which not only would affect us, obviously, but may even affect them in some way.
Right. And one other idea that people in the ufology community talk about with these beings is that possibly they could be survivors of previous civilizations, maybe from before the flood or the destruction of Atlantis or something like that, who retreated underground, and they've just been living kind of in secret and advancing their technology, which you would think would be far more than the surface if they had been around for so long. And it's also a crazy idea. It's just as crazy as these beings being from outer space, but it kind of makes me think that that's why they might have such interest in keeping the planet safe, because it's their home too. I don't know. It's a weird idea, but have you ever entertained that thought?
Not really. I do believe that there are underwater bases, and there's evidence also that some of these objects fly into mountains or into volcanoes and could have underground bases. So at this point, I'm not going to discount any possibility, no matter how crazy it sounds.
Right.
Because we just don't have a complete story, a complete picture of where these beings are from, what they're up to.
Right. It's a really weird situation, but every time someone like you comes forward, we get another little piece of the puzzle, and I think you add these things together and we get a clearer picture, and it's happening all the time. But in your book, you also say that for your money, you would put it down on the fact that an international UFO cabal is most likely responsible for the secrecy that we have. And that's interesting. I definitely think that's likely. But how do you think this group was formed? I mean, do you think they answer to anyone?
Well, I think if I had to, and again, this is speculation, but if I had to pin it down, I'd say it probably originated after the Roswell crash in 1947. Because the Air Force initially stated that they had recovered a saucer, and then a day later they were overruled by higher-ups. So that started the cover-up, the basic cover-up that the Air Force and other government agencies in the United States have been involved in. Now, as you point out, these incidents have occurred worldwide, so from that standpoint, there's probably individuals within governments in other countries that somehow the United States agents, let's say, because again, it's not the U.S. government that I place in this cabal. It's individuals, a select group of people, probably within intelligence agencies of the U.S. government that are part of this cabal. And they've probably made contact with intelligence groups in other countries that are handling this secret, and they've probably been doing so since about 1947. In fact, in 1950, a man by the name of Wilbert Smith, an engineer working for the Canadian government in the United States during a project he was doing with a top scientist in the U.S., was told that the UFO question is being studied by a secret group, and this secret group is headed by Vannevar Bush. Vannevar Bush was the top scientist, U.S. top scientist during World War II. He was the one that oversaw the project for the first nuclear bomb test and a bomb. So certainly there's good evidence that this secret group does exist and has existed since at least 1950.
And I know that Boeing did a study of your incident, but I'm inclined to think that companies like Boeing and Lockheed Martin, they might even have more secrets than the government. I wonder how involved they are with shaping some type of international cabal on this UFO topic.
Yeah, well, again, I have little doubt that we have recovered craft and beings, extraterrestrial beings, and have gleaned scientific knowledge from them and the craft, and attempted to convert that to uses in our own military and aerospace companies. Philip Corso mentioned this. Philip Corso, of course, you probably heard of him. He was very much involved in the transfer of technology from what was studied as a result of recovery of the Roswell crash. So yeah, I think all of the major aerospace companies have classified programs working with the military on these things, and so again, that to me, the ability to transfer that technology in a classified manner, a secretive manner, would be fairly easy to do.
Yeah, and your book has so much interesting information on this and just secrecy in general and the way it's handled. A couple of points that I just thought they just blew my mind. I was kind of surprised. In 2009, the American Civil Liberties Union did a study. There's over 2.4 million Defense Department personnel that hold security clearances. I mean, that is so many. Of course, they're different levels, but also in 2010, the Information Security Oversight Office made 76.8 million classification decisions and a 40% increase from the previous year, which cost taxpayers 10.2 billion just in 2010 for the added effort and classification activities alone. That's just this one little section that keeps secrets from us. I mean, that seems a bit excessive, especially when you have people starving on the streets.
Well, no, let's clarify that a little bit. ISOO is a government group that reports to the president every year on the classification of material within the government agencies. So that 7 million, or I can't remember the number.
76.8 million classification decisions?
76.8 million, it covers all agencies within the government. So that's all military and other agencies.
Right.
But that's still an awful lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is astounding. That's why I titled that chapter, excessive secrecy. It's just very it's extreme, and that ultimately affects our democracy because it keeps the public uninformed, and an uninformed public cannot properly monitor its government and what they're up to. So that to me that does affect our democracy.
Right.
So this is something, again, the public ought to be outraged about.
I agree, man. And we are at about the halfway point. I wanted to switch gears a little bit, talk about your other experience. This one you had in 1985. Kind of funny, your first experience is March 24th. My birthday is March 25th, and I was born in 1985. So add it together. This is a lot more personal than what happened to you on the job in 1967. This is closer to the realm of an abduction. Can you kind of tell us what you remember from that experience?
Yeah, I'll preface it by saying that what I'm about to say is a result of 4 hypnotherapy sessions I've had with various hypnotherapists. I've had with 3 separate hypnotherapists. And I didn't talk about this for a long time. I only recently decided, when I wrote this book, decided to come forward with this. And the reason I did is because the public needs to understand that this phenomenon is more complex than we can even imagine. And the abduction phenomenon, or abduction aspect of this phenomenon, is major. It's a major part of their objectives. By their, I mean, I do believe this is extraterrestrials. So I'll go through my incident. In 1985, we were living in Manhattan Beach, California, at a location that I recall specifically because what I did in Manhattan Beach was to remodel homes and fix them up, sell them, then move on. I was trying to get close to the beach, and I knew where I was in 1985.
Mm-hmm.
My wife and two small children were living in the house. One night, I wake up and for some reason, I just wake up and notice that there's a bluish colored light coming from our living room. And I wake up my wife, and she also sees the blue light. And I tell her I'm going to get up and investigate because, somebody may be in the house. So I start to get up out of the bed, and all of a sudden I'm paralyzed. I cannot move. And so this is reason number one, this was not a dream, is because I remember the intense struggle I had trying to get my mobility back. I was just flailing on the bed and struggling with everything I had to try to get my strength back.
Scary.
My mobility. It was frightening. And so I turned to my wife and asked for help, and she's out. She's unconscious, which is, unheard of because we had two small kids.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, next thing I remember, I'm looking at the doorway to our bedroom, and I see this hooded individual. And I can't make out a face even to this day, but I do remember a hood, dark individual. And then I also became aware that there were others in the bedroom. And it was just a sense that there were others in the bedroom. And then the next thing I recall is floating off the bed and floating towards our bedroom window. Now, I had locked that bedroom window the night before. I guess it was just a habit I'd gotten into. And I thought to myself, they don't know how to open this window. It was latched. Now, by that, I've implied to myself, and I've convinced myself that they did not seem like adults, or they did not seem like adults that knew how windows operated. So, but it didn't matter because I went right through the window. The window was closed, and I went right through the window. I know how crazy this sounds, but that's what I recall happening. I went right through the window. The next thing I remember, I was on a table, presumably on board a craft. I had three beings around me, and one of them held a long needle in his long, bony little hands. I remember the fingers, the appearance of the fingers, but this needle could have been about a foot long. I mean, it was long.
Wow.
And he wanted me to see it. He actually placed it in front of my eyes. He wanted me to see it. He told me, and this, again, is not verbally, it's telepathically. I was told that they were going to insert this needle into my groin area. It was not going to hurt, but as they started the procedure, it hurt like hell, and that's point number 2 of why I think this was not a dream, because the pain was excruciating. I've never had any pain like that, and before or since.
Jeez.
When I complained about this pain, the pain went away almost immediately. So that's what happened there. After that, I recall being taken off the table, sat on what seemed to me like a bench area. There was another, we'll call him extraterrestrial, in adjoining room. I was taken there and had what seemed to be like a checkup. He poked me in the back, again, fingers along my spine. After that, I was escorted by 2 beings, one on either side. And again, we were floating. We weren't walking. We were floating off the surface, and then floated through a tunnel, a curved tunnel. And then there was this white flash of light, and I was back in my bed.
Wow.
Again, all this, I did not remember any of this the next morning. In fact, I didn't remember any of this until about 7 years ago. After, being involved in this and talking to other people, some of these little bits of what I just told you came floating back into my memory. And that's when I decided to have a session, initial session about 7 years ago with a therapist, and started getting back some of these things. And then the final thing that convinced me that this is not a dream was my wife coming to me, and after I told her about seeing a blue light, she came to me later and said she saw the blue light. So she confirmed to me that yes, in fact, she had also seen the blue light that night. So those three things convinced me that this was real. It was not something I fabricated, made up.
Wow. That is an amazing story. And I've heard you talk about it a little bit before, and there's a couple of indications that this has happened multiple times because of the layout of the room, right?
Right. My wife remembers the doorway and the window being at a different location than I do. But if we jump forward a couple of years, not more than a couple, 1992, we lived in Seattle and had a house there that fits what she recalls as the location of the doorway and the window. But again, I had a different recollection than she did. So, and also, she has a recollection of her waking up and seeing the blue light and then going back to sleep. And I was not awake during that incident. So we're thinking that we probably had multiple incidents. But she, at this point, does not want to go through therapy, and so that's where we are right now.
Wow. That is such a wild story. It's very consistent with other abduction reports. A lot of people talk about a hybridization program going on. They're putting a
Right,
large needle in your groin area. You might have
right.
some alien hybrid children out there, Robert.
I just might. I just might.
It's a weird thought, but I mean, what else are they doing?
Yeah, there's no doubt. There's been so many witnesses, abductees that have talked about seeing hybrid children on board craft, asked to hold a hybrid child that they're told is theirs, told to give it love, and things like that. So that's it's very likely that there is a hybridization program going on.
And you also have a chapter in the book that I really loved where you talk about some other UFO stories of people's testimony, things that I had never heard, stories that I wasn't familiar with. One of them, this guy John Mulliken, he has a story that's pretty similar to yours, right?
Oh, not exactly. I think you're thinking of John Doe. I've got John Mulliken was 17 years old, lived in up here in Central California. 1959, he lived near Beale Air Force Base, which in 1959 was a B-52 base. They had B-52 bombers and again nuclear weapons. And he recalls as a teenager seeing UFOs fly over the base and over his home,
Mm-hmm.
and would watch as fighter jets were sent out, scrambled against these UFOs and chased them. And so he'd watch these chases in the evening. And one time, one of these UFOs came very close to him and came down, and actually three of the beings waved to him. um, but he's a very credible witness. As a matter of fact, I went out and interviewed not only him, but his mother, who also saw these objects, and she confirmed that yes, indeed, they were flying over. Um, and John had a couple of photographs which I put in my book, and they confirm photographs that were taken from another source, 1965, where the UFO, when it left at high speed, left a smoke ring. And in LA, of course, we have a lot of smog. At least in '65, we had a lot of smog. And the theory is that this soot or smog collected on their craft, but when they left at high speed, they left this smoke ring of soot behind.
Yeah.
And John Mulligan had a photograph which also shows a smoke ring left behind after a UFO flew off.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. He said when the craft, well, John said when the craft did look through the window and when they waved at him, he felt a euphoric feeling, like it's almost as if they were family.
Yeah,
Very strange.
right.
And then I believe, I'm looking at the book now, but I believe it was this same John Mulligan fellow who had a second experience later where someone was in his room
Mm-hmm.
and he was floated to a craft, and then he later felt pain in the groin.
Yes.
That's the aspect that I thought was pretty similar to yours.
Oh, yes, absolutely. That aspect was. So, yeah, what can I say? It's
Yeah, it does leave you kind of speechless. It's a weird situation. Another woman, Josie Zwinenberg, she had a really interesting story. The aspect that I thought was kind of crazy is that, and it backs up your theory about the UFO cabal, is she had a encounter where she saw something, and then 31 years later, somebody approached her and started talking to her about that incident and even mentioned to her, hey, you remember when you heard something in the bushes? And she was like, whoa, I never told anybody that. And they said, well, hey, we've been watching you since that day for 31 years. And that is kind of
yeah,
collaborating evidence to your theory about the cabal.
yes, exactly. And Josie is, by the way, that's her real name. Yeah, exactly what you said. That fairly recently she ran into someone while she was on vacation. He told her some things like the rustling in the bushes that she heard when she approached the UFO that she saw. Nobody else knew that unless they were there. And so that was just amazing. Josie's a very credible individual. But it does point out the fact that this UFO cabal has a group of people that are tracking witnesses. And I think the reason they're doing that, number one, is because witnesses are sometimes visited multiple times by UFOs.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, they want to keep track of that. But they also want to keep track of whether or not these witnesses are talking and what they're saying to the public. Because obviously the cabal, their main purpose is to maintain this secret.
It just seems so odd. After 31 years, 3 decades of watching someone, I wonder what prompted this person to actually make face-to-face contact with her.
Hard to say, except possibly trying to frighten her. You know,
Intimidation, yeah.
This happened after she and I had made contact, and again, I'm pretty certain that I'm being monitored. My emails, my telephone conversations are being monitored because I've been a public witness for, like I say, 20 years. So they would have known. We know the NSA is monitoring our emails, so they
Right.
would have known that I had made contact with this other witness, Josie.
Yeah. Man, it's a fascinating story. The book is chock full of really cool information. I really like the section you have on the various types of evidence we have. One story you talk about that some footage of a UFO acceleration was caught on film and analyzed by this Dr. Bruce Maccabee. And in his professional opinion, he assesses the speed is over 500 G.
Well, not speed,
Or the acceleration.
acceleration that these ET pilots, let's say, would have to endure 500 G turns, things like that. So how does that happen? I mean, this stuff is just so amazing. It's hard to wrap your head around it, but this cabal is accumulating this information. They probably have secrets as to how the propulsion systems work, the kind of energy they're using, how they apply that energy, and a myriad of other things that is very valuable information, and information that could be used as, let's say, negotiating chips with other countries through the international network of this cabal, and also could be financially valuable if this information is converted into some technology that's used by industry. So I think that's the main reason these secrets are being kept right now is simply greed and power.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's a question of whether or not the public could accept this reality, because I think most of the polls show that at least 50% of the population believe that yes, these UFOs are real, and we are being visited.
Yeah, a lot of people seem to think that it has to do also with free energy or the type of technology they use, that if you were to unlock that for the masses, that we wouldn't be able to be charged by GE every week.
Yeah, right. And the oil companies would have problems too. So, yeah. So it's very complex. The UFO phenomenon is complex, but the way the way it's being controlled, the information is being controlled, keeping it away from the public is complex also.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of disclosure in general, in 2013, we know we had the citizens hearing for disclosure that made a decent amount of waves. It got a little bit of publicity.
Mm-hmm.
But do you know of any plans for a follow-up event or advancing that thread at all in the next couple of years?
Well, yes, I've heard that Stephen Bassett, who organized the citizens hearing in 2013, has now, as of last week, sent copies of a video which has some of the stories. I haven't seen this video, but it has some of the testimony that was given in Washington in 2013. And this video was sent to each of the sitting congressmen and women in the House and the Senate. And I think he's going to try to follow up, make phone calls, and see if we can get some interest in talking to these people and possibly having an actual hearing. That would be the objective.
Right. Yeah, that really is what needs to happen. I just sometimes it can go either way. On Monday I'll think we're making progress on disclosure, and on Tuesday I'll be convinced that we're never going to get there. It goes back and forth, man.
I know how you feel. It's very frustrating.
Well, Robert, UFOs are always a great topic for my money. I've had a great time. You don't get to talk to someone who's watched UFOs shut down missiles or been in the room and also had a needle shoved into his groin on an alien craft every day. And we just combined the two. So thanks for being the highlight of my week. Would you like to tell the people where they can get your book and keep up on you a little bit before we call it in?
Oh, sure, Greg. They can go on Amazon.com. I've got two books for sale there. One is called Faded Giant. I wrote that in 2005. Basically talks about my incident at Malmstrom